They saw a target. She saw a system. Witnessed the brilliant mind that turned a public humiliation into a revolution. Perhaps you should consider a less demanding subject, Miss Lawrence. Not everyone has the frame of mind to understand advanced biochemistry. The silence that followed was so dense that it seemed like a physical entity in the Westridge University classroom. 200 eyes converged on Sarah Coleman, the only black student in Dr. Arthur Thorne's class, whose expression of superiority barely disguised the venom in his words. Sarah felt the heat rising in her neck. It wasn't the first time the professor had publicly humiliated her, but today he had crossed an invisible line. The comment wasn't just about her response, it was about her presence in that space, a cruel reminder that for some, her place there would always be questioned, no matter how brilliant she was. The tension was broken by nervous laughter from some students, others looked away, embarrassed at witnessing such humiliation, but not bothered enough to intervene. "Answer the question, Miss Lawrence," pressed Dr. Thorne, adjusting his glasses with a theatrical gesture. "Or would you prefer to admit that you're out of your depth?" Sarah took a deep breath. At 22, she had spent her whole life being underestimated. The daughter of a cleaner and a bus driver, her path to that elite university was paved with scholarships earned for exceptional performance. What no one in that room suspected was what was hidden behind those calm, calculating eyes. "The CRISPR-Cas9 enzyme," she began, her voice calm but perfectly audible, "acts like molecular scissors through a two-step biochemical mechanism. First, it recognizes specific sequences in the target DNA using a complementary guide RNA. Then, the Cas9 causes a break in the DNA double strand precisely at the target site, allowing gene editing." Dr. Thorne frowned. The answer was correct, but far from complete. It was the perfect cue for more humiliation. Elementary, Lawrence. Any first-year student would know that. His smile grew predatory. "Now, explain the ethical implications of the study by Wong et al. On gene editing in human embryos, published in Volume 87 of Nature Biotechnology, page 834, if I'm not mistaken." It was a perfect trap. That particular article wasn't in the course bibliography. Thorne had only mentioned it in passing weeks ago, without requiring her to read it. Sarah looked directly into the professor's eyes. A heavy silence gripped the room as everyone waited for the inevitable failure. But then she began to speak. "The study by Wong and colleagues, published in Nature Biotechnology, Volume 87, pages 834 to 841, presents ethical problems in three distinct spheres," Sarah declared, her voice gaining confidence. "Firstly, it questions informed consent, since embryos cannot consent to permanent modifications to their genome. Second, it raises questions about inequality of access, potentially creating a new form of social division based on genetic enhancements. And third, as the authors explicitly state on page 837, it sets precedents for non-therapeutic modifications that could fundamentally alter the course of human evolution." Dr. Thorne's gaze went from arrogant to incredulous. He adjusted his suddenly tight tie. "Correct," he conceded dryly. "Although I doubt you understood the subtler nuances of the argument." "Actually, Professor," Sarah continued, still unperturbed, "the article also mentions in the conclusion that the balance between innovation and precaution must be established through an inclusive global dialogue. Wong specifically cites complementary studies by Garcia and Patel that challenge this view, suggesting that delaying the implementation of gene therapies has its own ethical cost in human lives." The entire auditorium held its breath. Sarah had quoted exactly word for word not only the article mentioned, but also its related studies. Dr. Thorne's face turned an alarming shade of red. How could she know that? How could an ordinary student recite verbatim a scientific article mentioned only once in passing months ago? What the arrogant professor and his colleagues didn't know was that Sarah Coleman was no ordinary student. Behind that quiet appearance lurked a mind with extraordinary abilities that was about to turn that public humiliation into something very different. If you like this story of justice and overcoming, be sure to subscribe to follow other equally inspiring stories. After all, what would happen when Sarah finally revealed her true potential? Dr. Thorne was about to discover that he had chosen the wrong victim for his cruel game of academic humiliation. The auditorium remained absolutely silent as Dr. Arthur Thorne tried to regain his composure, his pale fingers drumming nervously on the polished wood of the lectern, narrowed eyes fixed on Sarah Coleman as if she were an equation that refused to be solved. "You seem to have memorized a few articles," he finally said with a cold smile. "A useful skill, although it's no substitute for true understanding. Let's test your critical thinking skills, something that no amount of mechanical memorization can simulate." Sarah noticed the condescending tone in mechanical memorization. The insinuation was clear. In Thorne's mind, she was just a memorizing machine, not a true intellectual. The whisper of a nearby student reached her ears. "He won't give up until he humiliates you." "Consider the following bioethical problem," Thorne began, completely abandoning the lesson plan. "A remote community suffers from a rare genetic disease. The only cure available would require experiments on their own children. This community has limited resources to fully understand the risks. As a researcher, would you implement such a treatment? Justify your answer using Harrington's model of scientific responsibility." It was a deliberately complex and ambiguous question. There was no perfect answer, only the opportunity for Thorne to criticize whatever position she took. From her seat in the third row, Dr. David Lee, a professor of medical ethics who was attending the class as a departmental observer, frowned. Thorne's hostility was evident even to an outside observer. Sarah took a deep breath. "Professor, that question presents a false dichotomy. Harrington's model, as published in his seminal 2019 paper, specifically emphasizes that these scenarios should consider a spectrum of approaches, not binary choices." She continued, her voice gaining confidence. "An ethically informed approach would follow Harrington's three-tiered protocol. First, education and capacity building in the community. Second, development of a community council with significant decision-making power. And third, gradual implementation with constant monitoring and participants' right to withdraw." Dr. Thorne swallowed, visibly upset. "You are clearly reducing a complex dilemma to..." Page 47 of Harrington's article, Sarah interrupted him gently, quote, "The greatest ethical mistake is to assume that vulnerable populations are incapable of understanding complexities when provided with adequate tools and time." A murmur went through the room. Some students began to exchange admiring glances, others typed furiously on their laptops. Dr. Lee leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. Thorne slammed his palm on the table. "This isn't a book club discussion, Miss Coleman. This is serious science." "I completely agree, Professor," Sarah replied without hesitation. "That's why I cited precisely the accepted and published methodology for addressing exactly this kind of ethical dilemma." Thorne's face turned scarlet. "Class adjourned for the day," he announced abruptly. "Next week, I want a full essay on the ethical limits of bioscience, Miss Lawrence. You stay. We need to discuss your performance." As the students gathered their materials, many cast worried glances at Sarah. A curly-haired student called Zoe Hayes approached quickly. "He's furious," she whispered. "I've never seen Thorne dismiss a class before." "I'll be fine," Sarah replied calmly, organizing her meticulous notes. Zoe hesitated. "Listen, some of us are going to Café Artemis afterwards. You should come. We need to talk about all of this." Sarah nodded, surprised by the unexpected invitation. As Zoe walked away, Sarah noticed Dr. Lee approaching Thorne, his face serious and determined. When the room emptied, Thorne closed the door with unnecessary force. "I don't know what your game is, Miss Coleman, but let me be absolutely clear." His voice was low, dangerous. "I've spent 30 years building my reputation at this institution. I have former students at Harvard, Stanford, and Oxford. I've supervised more prize-winning dissertations than you've had birthdays." He moved closer, invading her personal space. "And I will not allow a transfer student with some memorization trick to challenge my authority in my own classroom." Sarah stood her ground. "It's not a trick, Dr. Thorne. It's how my brain works." "I know exactly how it works," he hissed. "You've memorized a few articles, hoping to impress. Well, let me educate you on how the academic world really operates. People like you may get in here thanks to diversity policies, but real success, that takes more than memorization and quotas. The racist implication hung in the air like poison. Sarah felt her stomach churn but kept her face neutral. She had been trained all her life to never show how much words like that hurt. My final grade in this subject depends solely on your subjective assessment, doesn't it, Professor? She asked, her voice deliberately calm. A sinister smile crossed Thorne's face. Precisely. And believe me, I know many subtle ways of ensuring that problematic students find their true level. I suggest you consider this before our next meeting. When Sarah left the building 20 minutes later, the afternoon sky was darkening. Her phone vibrated. It was Zoe, sending her the exact address of the cafe. As she walked across campus, her brain, that extraordinary machine that was both her blessing and her burden, had already calculated exactly what she needed to do. What Thorne didn't realize was that by forcing her into a corner, he had inadvertently given her access to something far more valuable than a good grade. He had shown her his letters. And Sarah, with her memory that recorded every word, every gesture, every tone of voice, now knew her opponent perfectly well. At Cafe Artemis, a group of students were waiting anxiously. Among them was a young man carrying a disguised audio recorder, a tool from his internship at the campus newspaper. No one there suspected that the battle between Thorne and the quiet transfer student was just beginning, nor that the next few days would change the balance of power at that university forever. After all, what would happen when the professor discovered that his private threat had been documented, and that the student he considered inferior was about to use not only her extraordinary memory but the entire arsenal of her calculated brilliance against him? A week after the initial confrontation, the university amphitheater was packed. News of Dr. Arthur Thorne's open master class had circulated quickly, a rare event where students from all departments could attend the renowned professor on stage. Thorne adjusted the microphone, pleased with the impressive audience. Behind the scenes, something quite different was unfolding. Sarah Coleman had spent the week obsessively studying not just biochemistry, but Thorne himself. She scoured every published article, every interview, every dissertation he had supervised. Her photographic memory became a weapon, cataloging every contradiction, every inconsistency in 3 decades of academic production. At Cafe Artemis, an unlikely alliance had formed. Zoe Hayes, the student with the curly hair, turned out to be the editor of the university newspaper. Ryan Stone, the student with a tape recorder, was her assistant. Dr. David Lee, who also appeared by chance, offered discreet guidance. "Are you sure about this?" Zoe asked as they finalized their preparations. "Thorne has powerful connections. He could end your career before it even begins." "My career would be over anyway," Sarah replied calmly. "He made it very clear that I wouldn't pass his course, no matter how brilliant my work was." Now sitting in the front row of the amphitheater, Sarah looked extraordinarily serene. Dr. Thorne noticed her, his eyes narrowing momentarily before he began his lecture with his usual smug tone. "Today we will discuss the ethical limits of bioscience," he announced, his gaze deliberately avoiding Sarah. "I'll start with my own contribution to the field, the Thorne principle of ethical proportionality." That's when Sarah raised her hand. Thorne hesitated, visibly annoyed, but ignoring her in front of hundreds of people would have been too obvious. "Yes, Miss Coleman." His voice dripped with disdain. "Professor, before I go any further, could you clarify how your principle relates to the contrary position you defended in the Journal of Bioethics in 2018? A momentary silence overtook the auditorium. Thorne blinked, puzzled. "I'm afraid I don't understand your question. My work has been consistent for decades." "In fact," Sarah continued, her voice clear and strong, "in your article Ethical Frontiers in Genetic Research, page 142, paragraph 3, you argue verbatim that cultural and socio-economic considerations are secondary to scientific advancement, a position diametrically opposed to the principle of proportionality you are about to present." Murmurs ran through the auditorium. Thorne's face paled. "You are twisting my words, taking them out of context." I can quote the full context if you prefer, Sarah offered, her calm voice contrasting with Thorne's growing nervousness. Just as I can quote the 7 other articles where you directly contradict your own ethical principles when convenient for your corporate backers. The auditorium erupted into whispered conversations. In the audience, Dr. Lee watched with calculated interest. Dean Thompson, who had just entered discreetly from the back, frowned. That's completely inappropriate. Thorne pounded the pulpit. This is a lecture, not a debate. I completely agree, Professor, Sarah replied, standing up slowly. An academic lecture should present consistent and ethical ideas, not convenient contradictions that change according to funding. She took out a thin folder from her bag. I've compiled all your most blatant ethical contradictions from the last 15 years, including, she paused significantly, your demonstrably biased evaluations against students from minority groups. The auditorium fell deathly silent. Thorne was livid. How dare you, he began, but was interrupted when the side doors opened. 3 members of the university's ethics committee entered, led by Dean Thompson. It was no coincidence, Sarah had sent her meticulously referenced compilation to them 3 days earlier. Dr. Thorne, the dean called out, his deep voice echoing in the tense silence. I believe we need to talk. Thorne looked around like a cornered animal, then fixed his furious gaze on Sarah. You, he hissed into the still-on microphone. Don't know who you're dealing with. Sarah stepped forward, her gaze direct and firm. On the contrary, Professor. I know exactly who I'm dealing with. You told me that you knew many subtle ways of ensuring that problem students found their true level. She looked meaningfully at Ryan, who held up the small tape recorder. Fortunately, I know a few ways myself. The color completely left Thorne's face as he recognized his own threatening words. In the back rows, someone began to applaud, soon followed by others until an ovation overtook the auditorium. What had begun as a public humiliation of a student had turned into something very different, a moment of poetic justice catalyzed by the extraordinary mind that Thorne had tried to diminish. As the dean led a visibly shaken Thorne off the stage, Sarah remained motionless, calm, knowing that the storm that would follow would be intense. After all, she hadn't just defied a professor, she had defied an entire system that had allowed her behavior to go unpunished for decades. The question now was, would the institution stand up for truth and justice, or would it close ranks to protect one of its own? And what would happen to the brilliant student who dared to expose the hypocrisy of one of the university's most powerful professors? 3 weeks after the confrontation in the amphitheater, the Westridge University community was still reeling from what became known as the Thorne affair. The ethics committee had concluded its investigation, and the results came as an academic earthquake. Sarah Coleman walked the corridors of the science building, observing how everything had changed. Students who had previously avoided her gaze now nodded respectfully, teachers who used to treat her with indifference made a point of greeting her. Sarah. Zoe Hayes ran towards her, waving a copy of the university newspaper. It's just come out. Front page. The headline was impactful, renowned professor removed after decades of systematic prejudice. The article detailed how the investigation, triggered by Sarah's meticulously documented complaint, had revealed a consistent pattern of discrimination in Thorne's evaluations against Black, Latino, and female students. The dean asked for an independent review of all his grades from the last 5 years, Zoe explained as they walked to the dean's office. Dozens of former students are coming forward with similar stories. The university had taken an unprecedented decision. Thorne had not only been removed with immediate suspension, but his mentoring privileges had been revoked. His office, that sanctuary of academic power, was being emptied at that very moment. In the dean's office, Sarah found not only Dean Thompson but also 3 members of the university council and, to her surprise, Dr. David Lee. Miss Coleman, the dean began, I would first like to offer our sincere institutional apologies for the treatment you have received. He slid an envelope across the table. We are offering you a full scholarship for the remainder of your degree and a guaranteed place in our doctoral program, if you wish. And I'd like to invite you to join my research group, added Dr. Lee. Your analysis of the contradictions in Thorne's publications has demonstrated not only your extraordinary memory but an exceptional analytical ability. Sarah accepted the documents calmly, but inside her, a wave of contradictory emotions was stirring. Victory was sweet, but there was a bitter taste too, the knowledge of how many other students like her had had their dreams shattered over the years. "Thank you," she finally replied, "but my biggest concern is the students who came before me, those whose careers have been sabotaged by prejudice disguised as academic assessment." The dean nodded gravely. "We are implementing a review committee to reevaluate previous cases with a possibility of academic redress. And more importantly, a new blind evaluation protocol to eliminate bias in the future." "It was Sarah who suggested that," added Dr. Lee with an approving smile. As she left the administrative building, Sarah was met by Ryan Stone and a diverse group of students. Among them were faces she barely recognized, students who had been silenced, whose voices were now finding courage. "You started a silent revolution," said a third-year Latina student. "Thorne once told me that I didn't have the right kind of mind for advanced research. Now I understand what he was really saying." "And where is Thorne now?" asked Sarah. Ryan smiled. "I hear he's packing up his belongings in record time. Apparently, 3 universities have already withdrawn visiting professor offers after the news leaked out." That afternoon, in the now crowded Café Artemis, Zoe climbed onto a chair and clapped her hands to attract attention. To Sarah Coleman, she raised her glass. "Who taught us that knowledge isn't just power, it's justice?" A round of applause echoed through the room. Sarah, typically reserved, felt the heat rise to her cheeks, but there was something liberating about finally being seen, truly seen, not just for her extraordinary brain, but for her courage. 3 months later, at a national bioethics conference, a familiar figure approached Sarah after her presentation on systemic bias in medical research. It was Thorne, visibly aged, his former air of superiority replaced by a complex expression. "You ruined my career," he said quietly. Sarah looked at him calmly. "No, Professor, you ruined your own career the moment you decided that some students deserved less than others, based not on their intellect, but on their appearance." He opened his mouth to retort, then closed it, defeated by the simplicity of the truth. "Your own words and actions condemned you," she continued. "I only had the memory to remember them, and the courage to repeat them." As Thorne walked away sullenly, Sarah realized a profound truth. Her photographic memory was an extraordinary gift, but her real strength had always been her ability to stand firm in the face of injustice, a quality that no IQ could measure. Sarah Coleman's story spread far beyond Westridge, inspiring students across the country to question systems that had long remained unquestioned. She had proved that sometimes all it takes to change an entire system is a single voice determined to speak the truth, even when that truth upsets the powerful. After all, the greatest power doesn't lie in memorizing facts or possessing impressive credentials, it lies in having the courage to challenge injustice when everyone else remains silent. For as Sarah discovered, knowledge without courage is just information, but knowledge with moral purpose becomes a transformative force. If this story touched your heart and you believe in the power of truth to transform unjust systems, leave a comment about a situation where you witnessed someone being underestimated but proving their worth. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories about courage and overcoming prejudice. After all, every story shared is another step towards a world where people like Sarah don't need to prove their worth to be respected.